Or the World Bank publication Living Through Crises shows how global crises affect the poor, more vulnerable and less visible populations in developing countries. Their realities and what they did to cope are the focus of the book authored by Rasmus Heltberg, Senior Social Development Specialist at the World Bank. He now joins us live from our studios in Nairobi. A very warm welcome to you, Rasmus.
Thank you, Hannah. It's a pleasure to be here.
One of the things that I wanted us to start off with is when we see what happened with the global financial crisis, some of the unrest that happened in some of the countries, it's a no-brainer that what happens hugely in the markets, and when the global financial crisis took place, that it really did affect people that were poor. So what is it that you would like to see come out of this publication, just in terms of how states, policymakers, and also researchers like yourself deal with the people that might be so vulnerable when these issues happen?
You know, there's a lot of focus about what crisis, food, fuel, financial crisis, what it does to businesses, to the private sector, even to governments. But there's not a lot of focus on what these crises do to poor and vulnerable people. So what we want to achieve is to call attention to the extreme hardships that the poor live under, especially when they're hit by these massive crises that we've seen in the last few years and that we are still seeing, frankly. This is still ongoing. We want to call attention that it's not just about getting enough food, it's also about food. It's also about the stresses that people live through trying to get enough food. It's about how people are forced to lower the quality of nutrition, of education, of healthcare, when they're struggling to make ends meet during a crisis.
Rasmus, one of the things that is discussed, and this was literature that I read, you know, of somebody who had read your book and was just commenting on it, and was saying that the role of social capital is very important and giving support to that social capital for these people. I would like you to talk a little bit about that and the role that the state can play in giving support to those structures that they then would be able to help the people that are vulnerable that you mention in this book.
Well, should the state give support to the social capital, or should they give it to the poor and vulnerable people directly? I think that's the question. First, but most fundamentally, the state should give support, because frankly right now there's very little given, and the poor have to fend for themselves. And yes, it's true, they rely on the social capital, as you mentioned. First and foremost, though, they rely on family, relatives, then on friends and neighbors, and on wider community structures, church groups, occupational groups, village groups. But you know what? Those structures are not effective enough. They really become eroded when you have these massive crises. We call them systemic shocks. They affect everybody in the community. Then there are no resources left to help those that are the most needy. Because frankly, those people who are a little bit better off, who maybe normally would step in to help, they can't afford it any longer. That's the reality that we're looking at.
Let's talk about a country like Kenya that has had, you know, disasters happen there, natural disasters, for instance, and also not only with that, that's something that your publication looks at, but also, I mean, they were hit by the financial crisis like so many countries were. So that's a really good example to use a country like Kenya that is on the African continent that has this double whammy when it comes to these disasters that happen. What were your key findings in a country like Kenya?
That's a great question, because a country like Kenya is really an example of extreme hardships during crisis, and these hardships are still ongoing. And we cover both, by the way, rural areas and urban slums. The key finding is that people are pushed down to the bare minimum, living on one meal a day, and very often the poor are forced into prostitution and into selling their last few assets and into violent crime and theft in order to survive. So we find an extreme example where stress and hardship just undermines the community norms that frankly normally would stop all these social ills from happening. It's really terrible what is happening, and how much of prostitution, of HIV/AIDS, and of crime and violence that can be traced back to the sort of the struggles to put food on the table.
Rasmus, one of the things that was interesting was not just violence, in terms of external violence, that somebody would go hungry and then they would steal, but also the issue was intra-family violence, where you would see that would increase, that abuse within families would increase because people were under a lot of financial pressure.
You see that a lot. These pressures translate into stresses and and then people easily erupt in violence. And it can be men being violent on women, and it can be women being violent on their children.
Rasmus,
and in Kenya, yeah.
Yes. What I would like us to focus on is that these are issues that I would imagine, people. I mean, here, if I just look here in South Africa, these are issues that we are aware of. That this is what does happen. But then again, I want to go back to what can be done in terms of practical steps. That whether it's a state, whether it is, you mentioned, structures like, churches, where these people would go and get that support. What can be done at a practical level?
Well, but let's not forget support to households and individuals also in the form of social safety nets, in the form of school meals to keep the children in school. School meals can be quite effective in making the children attend school more frequently. And to support community structures, that's something that we don't have a whole lot of experience with, but I think we should think harder about it. Can community groups sometimes step up to the plate if they're given support, financial support, but also maybe can we find out ways to support the norms and values in the communities where people look after each other, where when there is prostitution going on, just to earn a meal, that they say, can we find a better solution?
Rasmus, thank you so much for joining us. That was Rasmus Heltberg. He's Senior Social Development Specialist at the World Bank. And he was talking to us about coping mechanisms in developing nations after the global financial crisis.